worn it down since the beginning of the semester.
You say she's old?
Huh?
You say
I am old. I am well preserved, like a fossil. Okay. So, go ahead. You can do whatever you choose. Don't turn on the lights over me though, because nobody can handle direct light over 40. Okay. It's true, right? Overhead light. It's not good. Okay. So. Okay. So, what I asked you guys last time is to think about 3 scenarios for osmosis, and to see if you could figure out what each would correspond to. I asked you to think about drinking salt water when you're stranded on a desert island. I'll ask you to think about soaking in the tub. And I asked you to think about being dehydrated and going into the hospital. Okay? So let's start with the first one. Stranded on a desert island, no fresh water in sight, starting to get desperate. Why do you not drink salt water?
Because it will start shrinking all of your cells.
Shrinking all of your cells. What kind of solution is it compared to you?
It's a
hypertonic, very, very concentrated solute. You're going to regret your decisions. Okay, very, very concentrated solutes. So I want you to think about what happens. It's not just that it's going to shrink your cells. As you drink the salt water and it goes through your intestine, it is going to expose every cell that it touches to a hypertonic solution. And all of those cells are not only going to shrink, but where is their fluid going to go? From the cell into the intestine, right? It's going to get sucked into the intestine. And then you're going to have some nasty diarrhea, yeah? Yep. And then how much water are you going to have at the end of drinking salt water compared to what you had at the beginning? You're going to be more dehydrated, do you see? Because that is a hypertonic solution, okay? Okay, next question is, it's the middle of summer in Texas, and because this is how we do, drink a whole bunch of beer out on a boat in the hot sun. You get really, really dehydrated, right? And you end up in the hospital. You end up in the hospital for dehydration. And I've lost plenty of fluids. They could, of course, shoot me up with straight water into my IV. But they don't. What do they shoot you up with?
They do saline solution.
Yes, a saline solution that is what tonic to your blood cells? Isotonic. It should be isotonic to your blood cells. Does that make sense? Which is about 0.9% or normal saline, which is what they shoot you up with. Does that make sense? Now, there are situations, if those of you who have a little more clinical experience than me, in which they would use a hypotonic solution. But in a normal situation, if you were not extremely massively out of homeostasis, they would use an isotonic solution. Okay. Now, if you did shoot somebody up with straight water, you can, just so you know, and it will potentially cause hemolysis, but your kidneys are going to try to take care of it so quickly that it will start causing hemolysis when you have overwhelmed the capacity of your kidneys to take care of that, right? Because your kidneys are just going to continue to try to pee out the excess. Okay, and then last situation, you are soaking yourself in the bathtub. What type of solution do you think that you are in? You're actually in a hypotonic solution. You're in a hypotonic solution. No, it's not because you're sweating. You're sitting in a hypotonic solution because it's close to pure water. It does have some solutes dissolved in it. There's some mineral content and stuff, but it is a hypotonic solution. And so if you were in a hypotonic solution, that says that you should do what? What should you do in a hypotonic solution? You should swell up. And it looks like, however, you soak in the tub for 30 minutes and get out. And look at your fingers. It looks like they have shrunken, but they have not. They have swollen. And what happens is, remember that you actually have little spot welds in your epithelial tissue where the tissue is held down in some places. They're called hemidesmosomes. And it swells wherever it's not attached to a hemidesmosome, and it stays stuck wherever it is. And so you are actually swollen, but your fingers look like they're shrunken. And how can we confirm that? We can confirm that because we have incredibly sensitive scales that can measure the actual body mass when you get in versus when you get out, and you actually weigh slightly more when you get out. So you didn't shrink, you swelled up. You just didn't swell up nice and even. Okay? And why does it take a little while? Because keratin is a waterproofing or water resistant protein. So it doesn't happen, every time you just sit in there. You have to sit in there for a while. And that will get you a point on a trivia game at some point in your life. And that's very important. It's a very important goal. I am like amazing at trivia games, just like completely amazing. My husband's always like, this is like what you've been training for your entire life. It's got all that crap stored in your brain. And I'm like, oh yeah. Literally no job prospects for just being good at remembering random facts at all, right? And your friends don't even like it when you win all the time. So they just stop inviting you. Okay, so that's the last of osmosis. Okay, so now we are going to change gears and we're going to get into the concept of mediated transport. What? Yeah, mediated transport systems. So, because textbooks mean different things when they say that, I need you to understand what I mean when I say a mediated transport system. When somebody says they need a mediator to help with something, what is the mediator going to do? It's going to be a go-between. So if you're having like a really nasty divorce before you head to the lawyers and spend $20,000 each, right? There's a mediator, a go-between that helps you try to accomplish this very difficult thing. In my context, a mediated transport system uses a carrier protein. Some textbooks say that mediated transport systems use either channels or carriers, and I never mean that when I say mediated transport. I always mean carrier, okay? So if I say channel, if I mean channel, I'm going to say channel. So mediated transport systems use carrier proteins. And that matters because carrier proteins, of course, all have shape-specific binding sites, yes? Which means that, remember, they are all subject to saturation limits. So if, for instance, this were going through a channel and not a carrier, this curve would look different, right? Or if it were going straight through the cell membrane. If it were going straight through the cell membrane, as the concentration gradient went up, the net flux would go up, and it would be directly correlated, and there wouldn't be a saturation, right? Yeah? But if you are going through a carrier, because of the shape-specific binding site, it's subject to saturation. So when I'm saying mediated transport, it relates to carriers specifically, okay? So now let's talk about the three types of mediated transport that exist. Okay, so we've already met the first one, we just didn't give it a name yet. And the first type of transport is mediated transport is called facilitated diffusion. And I know you've met facilitated diffusion before. Facilitated diffusion is when you move something from high concentration to low concentration. That's why it's diffusion, across a membrane using a carrier. So this example that we've got up here, or the one that we'll build real quick right here, it's going to be facilitated diffusion. Okay, so let's move an amino acid. And let's say we've got a high concentration of it here and a low concentration of it here. Okay, so first questions that you have to ask is, can I move it straight through the plasma membrane? Why not? Too big, and what about solubility? Amino acids are water soluble. Okay, so it's too big and it's water soluble, so you're not going to get it through that way. Okay, what's the next cheapest way that you could attempt?
A carrier.
Not a carrier. Channel is next. Will a channel work? No. This is a mid-sized water-soluble molecule, and channels are too small for that, primarily for moving things about ion size, right? So channel's not going to work. So plan C is going to be moving it through a carrier. So let's say the amino acid has that shape. We have to have a shape-specific binding site. And what is, of course, going to happen is you are going to bind to that amino acid. The binding changes the shape of the transport protein such that you dump it. The dumping changes the shape of the transport protein such that you expose the binding site again. Good? Okay, so this is called facilitated diffusion because it's just diffusion because I am moving from high to low, but I need a helper. I need a facilitator. Yes? And the facilitator is what kind of protein again? Carrier. Yes, it's a carrier protein. right? So we have met this before because we can see the same image with glucose right up here, right? Glucose being transported. Will facilitated diffusion move things against their concentration gradient?
No.
It will not. It only moves things down their concentration gradient. Good? Okay, so that's easy, and you've learned facilitated diffusion before, right? So, everybody okay with that one? So, note to self, because it's diffusion, it doesn't require ATP, and it only moves things from high to low concentration gradients. Okay? All right, we're going to see examples of it today. Okay, so the next type of transport is called primary active transport. And primary active transport is going to be using a carrier to move something against its concentration gradient. Okay? And when you want to move things against their concentration gradient, you need to put energy in. So you use ATP as the energy source for this. So when I have a carrier plus ATP, they very often call it a pump. Okay, still a carrier, just so you know. It has a shape-specific binding site, and it uses ATP. And because of the two of those, it can actually move something against its concentration gradient. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to talk about primary active transport. Now, it doesn't even matter what size of thing you are trying to move. If I want to move an ion against its concentration gradient, I need to pump it. If I want to move glucose against its concentration gradient, I need to pump it. If I want to move anything water-soluble against its concentration gradient, I need to pump it. If I need to move lipid-soluble stuff against their concentration gradient, you're kind of screwed because they do whatever the hell they want, and it's generally down their concentration gradient. Okay? So this doesn't really have to do with the size of the particle so much as the direction that you want it to go. Okay? So I'm going to give you a metaphor, and we're going to build the one that you're going to see all semester long, and then we're going to apply it throughout the rest of the lecture. Okay, so the metaphor that I always use about primary active transport is this. If I were using diffusion, so if I just did diffusion, what would happen to this curve over time? Just diffusion. What would happen to it? Straight, okay, right? So with primary active transport, what I want is I want to do active transport. If I start out with a curve and I do active transport moves things from their low concentration to their high concentration against the concentration gradient. So if I do active transport, any idea what this would look like over time? It would either, depending on how fast I pumped it, I would either maintain it, or if I pumped it even faster, I could accumulate it. Does that make sense? Okay, so what if I already had a bunch of stuff in one place, but I still want more, right? I'm feeling greedy, okay? So the metaphor is like, have you ever seen anybody try to put 24 balloon bouquet into a car? Like into, or have you been that person? Into a hatchback. So I want you just to imagine that you are trying to take this 24 balloon bouquet, and you've opened your hatchback, and you're trying to get it in there. Well, what does it want to do? Is as soon as it starts accumulating, it wants to start diffusing back out. And so what do you have to do? You can't close the hatchback. How do you keep the damn balloons in there? You are constantly putting energy in to keep them accumulated on one side. As soon as you stop putting energy in, they will diffuse straight back out, right? So that's what's going to happen here. If you want an accumulation, then basically you are battling against what particles want to do, right? And so in order to maintain an accumulation, you're going to have to continue to put energy in. Especially since your cell can never close. It's like some Yahoo opened up the front two windows, right, when you were putting the balloons in, and they broke. And you can't close them. And you got to put them in, and then they keep coming out the windows, and you got to grab them and stick them back in, okay? So you have an accumulation. You're trying to accomplish an accumulation. It should make sense to you that that requires energy because you're trying to move against a concentration gradient. You don't need to put energy in to get water to move downhill, down the concentration gradient. You certainly do to get water to get pumped uphill, right? Okay, so what we are going to say is that in order to do this, you're going to require ATP. You're going to move things net, low concentration to high concentration. You're going to end up with an accumulation on one side, generally of a membrane. It's going to be really hard to have an accumulation if you don't have a boundary, right? Okay, and it's going to require a carrier protein plus ATP. What do you call a carrier protein plus ATP? Pump, exactly. Okay, so the carrier is what a carrier is, which means it's shape specific, okay, which means it's subject to saturation. You can also turn it on and off by changing the binding site temporarily. So I'm going to teach you the hardest one, but the one that you're going to see all semester long. And instead of having you memorize it, I'm going to teach it to you so that you'll be able to build it every time. And it's called the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, or the sodium-potassium counter-transport pump, or the sodium-potassium exchange pump. But it doesn't matter, because if it has sodium and potassium and pump in it, they're talking about the same one. It's just that the textbooks just don't seem to be able to agree at what other word goes in there, and I really don't care. I just call it the sodium-potassium pump. So I'll bring up a figure, and then we're going to build it together so that you can understand, instead of what it is, I want you to understand why it is. Okay, so we're not going to get to the pump for a second, but I need you to understand each little stage before we get there. And this is super important for the next set of notes too. Okay, so first is we're going to start out with just ECF and ICF. And there's very little memorization necessary here, but you do have to memorize one thing if you haven't already. Actually, it's two things. You have to memorize the relative concentrations of sodium outside and inside the cell, and the relative concentrations of potassium outside and inside the cell. And some of you guys already know that. Does anybody know where sodium is higher, outside or inside? Yeah, sodium is relatively higher outside the cell, and it's a positively charged ion, compared to inside the cell. And the ratio, by the way, is about 15 sodiums outside to every 1 you have inside. That's the concentration gradient for sodium. You guys with me? Okay, that is true about cells, and that is homeostatic, which doesn't mean it never changes. It means this is where we have to put it back, right, if we change it. Okay, the next truth is potassium concentration. Where is potassium higher? Yeah, the potassium concentration is relatively higher inside the cell and lower outside the cell. And it's also positively charged. And potassium's ratio of potassium to potassium is about 30 inside to every 1 outside. Okay, you guys with me? Okay, this is important because this is homeostatic for the cell, okay? We will see how it's used in homeostasis as we progress a little this semester. But just know that just like everything else, blood pressure or body temperature, you can screw it up, but you have to put it back. And you have to put it back pretty readily in order for you to stay in homeostatic health. Okay, so we're just going to start out with these things memorized. And then we're going to start to sort of build a cell. Go ahead.
So with potassium, that's homeostatic health too? 30
Yes,
to 1.
30 to 1 for potassium, 15 to 1 for sodium, and the opposite directions, right? You guys with me? Okay, so we're going to build the cell slowly, and I want to make sure you understand each part before we go any further, because this is like fundamental to the really hard set of notes, which is next. It's not actually that hard if you have a good baseline. If you don't pay attention to this, it's really hard. Okay, so what I want you to imagine, just imagine we're building the life of a cell, and it doesn't quite work this way, but it's a really good way to understand it. I want you to imagine that this cell is starting out. I haven't put anything in yet. No channels and no carriers, right? That means that sodium and potassium are trapped. Does that make sense to you? Okay. And then I also want you to imagine that before I start moving anything, I want you to know that the ICF is net neutral. That means for every positive there is a negative, right? It has no net charge. The ECF is net neutral. For every positive there's a negative, okay? We'll talk about the source of the negatives a little bit later, but you got me? Okay, no charge, no charge. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in leak channels, okay? And this is going to be a sodium leak channel. Leak. And this is going to be a potassium leak channel. Okay, all right. So question. Which direction is sodium going to move through that leak channel? Inside. And why? It doesn't have anything to do with charge because there's no charge to deal with. So why is it moving? It's just moving down its concentration gradient, correct? Okay. And then potassium. Which direction is potassium going to move? Out. Okay. And why? Concentration gradient. Okay. Now, this part you may not get the first time, and that's okay, because we will cover it again from a different angle in the next set of notes. You can get it the first time, the next set of notes will be way easier for you. So, just put in those channels, okay? And by the way, what kind of transport is that we're doing there? It's just passive or diffusion, right? It's diffusion through a channel, right? Okay, so do you see look at the concentration gradient for sodium, 15 to 1, and the concentration gradient for potassium, which is 30 to 1. And tell me, as soon as you put in those channels, are those two ions going to leak at the same rate?
No.
No. Which one's going to leak faster?
30 to 1. 15 to 1.
15 to 1?
Sodium. Or 30 to 1.
30 to 1 is going to leak faster, right? Because you know that the concentration gradient determines the speed of transport, correct?
Right.
Okay, so I want you to put in these channels and then let them leak for a second, okay? And does everybody understand that initially, if I just am dealing with not charge, I'm just dealing with concentration gradient, can you see that potassium will leak faster than sodium initially? Yes? Okay, let it do that for a second.
It's just because it's higher, right? From
Because of higher concentration gradient. Yes, yes. Okay, so you let them leak for a second, and then I am going to show you what happens with the charge, and you see if you can figure it out, okay? There was no net charge anywhere, right? But as soon as you let them leak, and they leak unequally, what's going to end up happening is the outside of the cell is going to have a slight accumulation of positive charges, and the inside of the cell is going to not accumulate, but reveal negative charges. Can you see? I didn't move any negatives around. I started out net neutral, neutral, right? You with me? Started out neutral, but then I moved more positives out than I moved positives in. Yes? And I ended up with a slight accumulation of positives on the outside and a slight deficit of positives on the inside, right? Which revealed the negatives on the inside. Can you see that? Go ahead.
So you go off of the deficit of the positives to reveal the negative in the
Yes, exactly, because you started out neutral,
Okay.
right? I didn't say there weren't any negatives in there. I said that there were negatives to cancel out every positive, right?
Got it. Okay.
Right?
Mhm.
So it started out net neutral. By the way, most proteins are negatively charged and cells are chock full of proteins, by the way. Is that okay? So can you guys see that? If you can't, you're welcome to ask a question. And if you don't get it this time, we'll address it from a different perspective the next time. Okay, so one more time. Started out closed, right, with just concentration gradients. Okay, add in channels. Initially, the reason that things move is going to be just due to their concentration gradients, but their concentration gradients were not the same. So that means that potassium is going to move faster out than sodium moves in. Yes? If I started out neutral, and more positives move out than I have positives move in, I start accumulating a slight excess of positives on the outside, and I have a slight deficit of positives or the reveal of negatives on the inside. Okay, go ahead.
Is it because of the ratio, because the potassium ratio is
Yes,
higher?
it
than
is,
the
yes.
Sodium outside? Okay,
Mhm.
that
There are
makes
also, by the way, more potassium channels, but it doesn't really matter right now. It will still happen, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's just because of the concentration gradient. Okay, so now just stick this in your head. This that you have right there that's homeostatic for the cell. So now what I want you to understand is this is how I need to keep the cell for the rest of the life of the cell. It needs to have, it's going to get messed up, but I have to put it back. 30 to 1, 15 to 1, positive on the outside, negative on the inside. Okay, that's homeostatic for every damn cell that you have. Okay, so now, can you see that if I just let it diffuse for a minute, I'm going to lose that, right? You can't just let it diffuse for a minute because what's going to happen to the sodium concentration gradient? No concentration gradient. What's going to happen to the potassium concentration gradient? No concentration gradient. As soon as you lose your concentration gradients, you don't have a charge gradient either, right? So the question is, how the hell do you maintain this, which is homeostatic, despite the fact that you've always got windows open? And you can't close the windows, and I know that that's the first thing you want to do. You're like, what the hell are you putting those in there when those are like jacking everything up? We will see later that those are super important. So how are you going to maintain this despite these? And the answer is you are going to put in a pump that is constantly and consistently working against the direction that things are diffusing. So this is going to be called the sodium-potassium pump. And I'm not going to have to tell you because you're going to have to tell me. Which direction is the sodium-potassium pump going to pump sodium if its job is to maintain homeostasis? Out. Yes? Yes? No?
Ask the question again.
Which direction is the sodium-potassium pump going to pump sodium if its job is to maintain homeostasis? As to pump it back out because it's diffusing in and trying to jack up your concentration gradient, right? Do you see that if you constantly let it diffuse in, you'll lose your 15-to-1? So what do you have to do with it? You have to pump it back out. Yes? To maintain your 15-to-1.
Because the sodium is going in.
Right, and the other question is also this. If you wanted it to move in, would you have to pump it anyway? No, you have to pump it because it would move down its concentration gradient. It would diffuse, right? So, if you wanted it to move in, would you have to pump it? No. If you wanted to move in, it just leaks in, right?
Yeah.
Right? So the sodium-potassium pump pumps move things against their concentration gradient. All right? So you're putting it back. You're trying to restore homeostasis. Okay, same question with potassium. If the job is to maintain homeostasis, which direction do you need to pump potassium? In. This is what you're trying to maintain. Just remember. Okay? But some Yahoo left the windows open. Okay? And you can't close them for reasons I promise I'll explain to you later. Go ahead.
So, let me get this right.
That's-
So you constantly, okay, so the windows,
Uh-huh.
pumping in, pumping out, and then
They're
you
not
have-
pumping. They're diffusing.
Okay, then you have the other one where you're constantly having this going on at the same time.
Exactly.
Some's coming in, some's going out, and you got to keep it
Right. It's basically like trying to air condition your house with all the windows open.
Okay.
It's going to be expensive as hell. Yeah? Okay. This is not temperature related, but it's a good metaphor for you. Okay. So, but of course, in order to get sodium to move against its concentration gradient and potassium to move against its concentration gradient, you will need ATP, correct? And ATP, when it's used, goes to ADP plus a phosphate. Okay? You all right? I'll show you an animation in just a second, too, to make it like stick. Okay? All right, so, it's okay. Oh, you got it? Okay, okay. This takes a minute. Okay, so, the sodium-potassium pump is therefore, like, responsible for maintaining homeostasis for the cell. How important are these? You have these on every single cell. And some cells screw up your sodium and potassium concentrations all the time on purpose to send signals. They do them on purpose. And that means that you would have more pumps, more active. The most energetic tissues in your body jacked with your sodium and potassium concentration gradients massively on purpose to send signals or, for instance, stimulate skeletal muscle contraction. And then you have to fix it every time. For that reason, believe it or not, at a cellular level, depending on the cell that it is, you use 40 to 60% of cellular ATP running your pumps, your sodium potassium pumps. So these are on every cell that you have. And the cells that mess it up have more of these. And what happens, just so you know, like just if this is homeostatic, what happens if this pump stops for a while? She's gonna get tired. I'm just gonna like take a break for like 30 minutes. You lose homeostasis, don't you? You lose your concentration gradients, and when you lose your concentration gradients, you lose your electrical gradients. And if that happens for long enough, the cell will actually die. And we'll see why this is useful in just a second. We'll see why you actually get these concentrations. Okay, so last thing, and this may not stick either the first time, and it's fine if it doesn't. You'll get the basics of it the first time, and then I'll show you an animation too. So now, we started out with no charge, and we let them diffuse for a second, and we accumulated a charge. And then we said, this is how we want it to stay for the rest of the cell's life. Just so you know, that split second with no charge is less than a nanosecond of the cell's life. This is the rest of the cell's life. Okay, so the cell pretty much has this charge almost the entire time it is a cell. Okay, so after you have this charge, which admittedly is most of the cell's life, I'm going to tell you that either sodium or potassium is going to speed up its diffusion rate after the charge exists. See if you can figure out which one. One is going to speed up its diffusion rate after the charge exists. Think about it for a second. A couple of you guys got it, a couple of you didn't. You'll get it by the end. What do you think? Anybody pretty sure? I will support you if you raise your hand, I promise. It's got to do with charge. Which one's going to speed up? Sodium. Sodium is going to speed up why? It's positive. It's always been positive, right? But now it's moving toward a negative. Yes? Okay. And what's going to happen to the speed of potassium transport after the charge exists? It's going to slow down. Exactly. Okay? Does that make sense? So just for that split second of the life of the cell, potassium is faster. But then as soon as you get a charge, potassium is going to slow down and sodium is going to speed up. So now what the pump has to do for the rest of the life of the cell is to balance out the rate of leaking, counting both concentration and charge. So this is the rate at which the sodium-potassium pump pumps. For every time it moves, it pumps 3 sodiums, 2 potassiums, and uses 1 ATP for the pump. Every single time.
So 3 sodium,
Out,
right?
2 potassiums in, 1 ATP to run it.
Is that why sodium speeds up that there's 3 sodiums?
No, it's the other way around. Sodium speeds up because of the charge, and the pump works that rate to balance out the diffusion rate. Exactly, yes. Okay, so to memorize I'm sorry? 1 ATP. So, by the way, way to memorize this. I've never met anybody who says potassium-sodium pump. Everybody says sodium-potassium. So if you say it that way, then this will work for you. I call it the 3-2-1 sodium-potassium pump because it's 3 sodiums, 2 potassiums, 1 ATP for the pump. Right? Does that make sense? Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, no, I was just wondering, can you go back to the sodium charge? That's what, like, so how sodium speeds up after the charge exists, how you said it's moving towards negative. Can you explain that to me?
Because remember,
Because it's slightly negative inside of it.
slightly negative inside. Yes.
Okay. That's
Got it?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was like,
And now do you understand why potassium slows down after the charge exists?
because, okay.
Because it's positive moving toward a positive, right? And so what this does is for the rest of the life of the cell, it maintains the diffusion, right? It maintains homeostasis despite that diffusion rate. Okay, so I'll show you guys an animation, and then I'll stop and let you guys ask questions again, and then we're going to talk about this again, and you'll see why you're going to go all this trouble a little bit later. So first animation so that you can have a brain break, and then
Yeah, you need a break. Love it.
That's a lot of data.
it is, yeah, and the next set of notes just depends on this, so you kind of have to get it. Okay, so starting with this image, I bet you can figure out what binds here. Sodium here, potassium here, ATP. Notice it's color-coded, okay? So what we are going to do is we are going to bind, hydrolyze ATP, and that gives us a big energy boost. Pop it off, and that is going to provide the energy to move sodium against its concentration gradient. And then I'm going to dump sodium on the outside. At the same time, I will reveal the potassium binding sites. Still have energy left in order to bring the potassium in. The trigger is going to be that phosphate will fall off, and I'm going to move potassium against its concentration gradient, and potassium is going to be brought in. Does that make sense? 1 ATP. No, 1 ATP total. Every time the sodium potassium pumps, yeah. Okay, so it isn't actually moving sodium and potassium simultaneously, right? They're like one after the other. But can you see that if I ever moved sodium and didn't move potassium, I don't have a useful pump anymore, right? So for all practical purposes, they are coupled, even though they're not simultaneous, right? So you move sodium out, and then you can't use the damn pump ever again unless you move potassium in, right? And it requires 1 ATP for all 5 things to move, right? 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. Good? Okay, so that is the sodium-potassium exchange pump, and we're about to see an example of why you went to all of this trouble in just a second. Okay, so does anybody have questions about the sodium-potassium pump? I have a question for you. What kind of protein is it? It's a carrier, yes. It's a carrier. They're always carriers, right? Carrier plus ATP is a pump, but it's still a carrier, right? Meaning it's definitely not a channel, right? And this is called primary active transport, is what it's called. Now, just so you know, this is a complex example of primary active transport. We have plenty of examples in which you're just moving one thing, one direction, like a calcium pump in which you're trying to pump calcium from low to high. Or a bunch of different pumps. So don't be surprised to see other examples. This is the one that's really important for you understanding the next set of no's. So go ahead.
So pumps do the opposite of leak channels. because
Exactly.
they're going
Against the concentration gradient.
instead of
Yes.
going- Yeah.
Yeah. So the question that I ask you, and pay attention when I ask you questions in your notes, even if you don't ever answer them in class, just pay attention when you're studying. So the problem that we run into and the disturber of homeostasis is that sodium and potassium will diffuse down their concentration gradients as soon as you put in channel proteins. And the channel proteins exist. And I know they seem like they're just troublemakers right now. Later on we will see that they're absolutely necessary. Despite the fact that you have channel proteins, you manage to maintain a 15-to-1 sodium concentration gradient and a 30-to-1 potassium concentration gradient. And I ask you how or why can you do that? And the answer is that the pump is basically constantly maintaining homeostasis by doing the opposite of what the leak channels do. Now, last concept about this is that the way that my brain works, which is useful for you to know because I write your test questions, is that I never memorize this. Do you see that if you got a little practice and you were really confident, that you could start with just the concentration of sodium and potassium, ICF and ECF, just there, and build the entire rest of it, right? Because you could put in the channels and see which direction they went, right? And then after the channels were in there, you wouldn't have to memorize which direction you needed to pump it, right? And you could stick in the pump and figure out which direction it goes. I need you to understand that that's how my brain works because that is how the brain works that writes your quiz questions and test questions, okay? So I've literally never memorized it. And there are all kinds of questions you can ask because I could ask you, which direction does sodium diffuse? Which direction is sodium moved by active transport, right? And then I can ask you charge questions, which I'll give you a little time to work on charge, but all that kind of stuff. And as long as you can build it, then there's no trick questions, right? What was your question, Brady?
Is there usually only one carrier
No.
pump per cell?
No, there's boatloads.
Okay.
It just gets really ugly. There's boatloads of channels and there's boatloads of carriers. And the more active the cell is in screwing up the sodium and potassium gradients, the more carriers you will have, the more pumps you'll have. Go ahead.
When you say you ask questions about how the concentration of like sodium moves out, you would look at it through the pump, right?
No, I have to. It depends on what I ask. If I actually ask you which direction sodium diffuses, then it's a leak channel, right?
Okay.
Which direction is sodium moved by active transport, then it's a pump, right? Okay, so all that crap that they were trying to teach you in 1610 ends up becoming really relevant because you have to understand this before I can teach you how the nervous system transmission works. Nervous system transmission will depend on you understanding this charge business, but you have to like build it piecemeal before people understand it because rote memorization doesn't work. You had a question and then I'll get you, Nikki.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
one of those fails, you said there's a whole bunch of them on the cell. If one of them fails, will the other ones just pick it up?
Yeah, and you can make more pumps, right? They're proteins, so you can actually make more pumps. It's not instantaneous, but yes. So yeah, there are a bunch of them. I wonder, I'll have to look up before we do the nervous system how many you would have on a typical neuron. I'd kind of like to know. I bet it's in the thousands or hundreds of thousands of those pumps. So collectively, these things are gobbling up 40 to 60% of your cellular ATP. This particular pump. Not one pump, but the pumps collectively, the sodium potassium pumps. And this is a huge part of maintaining homeostasis. And so, last little tidbit, and maybe this one will stick, and maybe it doesn't, and that's fine. Do you see that now because the homeostasis of the cell not only includes this and this, but also this, right? This charge gradient, this electrical gradient. Do you see that now the cell has just created a motivation or a potential for any ion to move across the cell membrane? Do you see that now not only have I created an attraction for sodium to move in, but any positive ion to move in? And do you see that I have now just created an attraction for any negative ion to move out, right? Because it doesn't matter how you created it, it matters that there is now a positive / negative charge. And so we are going to use this to get a massive influx of positive ions in sometimes, and sometimes a massive efflux of negative ions out, right? Because I set up this whole electrical nature of the cell. And even though I set it up with sodium and potassium, it doesn't really matter, right? Because now it's attractive to any positive ion, right? If I want calcium to move, and calcium's like on the outside of the cell, and calcium has a +2 charge, calcium is now like, yeah, that looks like a great place to go. Let's go in, right?
So
Now
what
calcium
happens
has
when it
attraction.
does? So what happens if it, like, you get a bunch of ions that come in?
Depends on why they went in there. We'll talk about a bunch of different instances in which calcium. Sometimes calcium moves in because it's the trigger for exocytosis. Sometimes calcium moves in to cause muscle contraction. There are lots of different reasons you would want to move ions, but what I'm telling you is we just set up a good motivation for all ions to move, right? That makes sense? And we're going to use it a bunch of different ways. Is that okay? Okay. So even though it came from sodium and potassium, its impact is not limited to sodium and potassium. Go ahead.
And a carrier and a channel are always, or proteins. Carrier and channel, proteins.
They're proteins, but carrier is different than channel.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
but they are proteins, yes. Okay, so it's called the transmembrane potential. So I know the word might not make a whole lot of sense to you, but transmembrane means across the membrane. I've just created the potential for ions to move across the membrane, which is what we call the transmembrane potential. Yeah? Okay, and it's going to be important because the nervous system and muscular systems are all going to be getting ions to move from point A to point B. Okay, so it'll be, I promise this will be worth your while. Okay, so now I'm going to show you one way in which we will make this work to our advantage. Okay, so we just talked about primary active transport. Okay, now we're going to talk about secondary active transport. But I need you to let me just describe it really slowly to you, and then I'll show you an animation. Okay, secondary active transport is a two-step process. The first step is not active, meaning no ATP is used. And the second step is active, meaning ATP is used. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. What I want to do is I want to bring something into the cell as cheap as I can, even though I already have a boatload of it in the cell. Okay, something that there is no such thing as too much of most of the time, like glucose. Glucose is like the most attractive of all the molecules, right? It's like money, okay? I want glucose inside the cell. What if I already had a boatload of glucose? Well, I still want more because I'm about to do a whole bunch of work, right? So I want accumulation of glucose inside the cell, and I want to get it inside the cell, even though there's already a bunch of it in there. Now, I could pump it directly, right? So stick with me. I could say, bind a glucose, use an ATP, bring a glucose in. Bind a glucose, use an ATP, and bring a glucose in, right? And I could directly pump glucose, but there's actually a cheaper way to do it, because what I've just created right here is a huge motivation for sodium to move inside the cell. Do you see I've just created a huge motivation, both electrical and chemical, and I always keep it that way, or if I mess it up, I always put it back. So now, instead of glucose having to pay to get in, it is going to go in a cheaper way. So I want you to think of it like this, okay? You've got somebody who says they're driving to Florida, and they've already planned the driving, and they're already paying for gas. And then somebody says, hey, can I ride with you? I'm not going to pay for gas, and I'm not going to drive at all. Well, it really depends on how hot she is, right? Like amazingly, incredibly, incredibly hot, maybe you will consider it. Glucose is the hottest of the molecules. And she's not going to do crap, but you still want her in Florida with you, right? So what's going to happen is sodium was heading into the cell anyway, but this time you're going to bring a hitchhiker with you, which is glucose. And now, instead of bringing sodium in through a channel, which I could, of course, and I will in other places, this time I'm going to bind sodium to a carrier because you can't fit her on the back of a moped. You need a car, right? And then the car will only start going when she is sitting in the other seat. And then what's going to happen is instead of using ATP to bring glucose in, I'm going to use the electrochemical gradient of sodium, right? So sodium wants to move in anyway because of its electrochemical gradient. I'm going to bring it in, and I'm going to bring in glucose with it. Now, can we see that that is cheaper? Because I want you to think about that. If I was pumping glucose in, because glucose was already high, but I still wanted more, right? Then it cost me 1, 2, 3 ATPs for 3 glucose. Now, I am going to bring in glucose with the sodium, glucose with the sodium, glucose with the sodium before I have to take care of the fact that I've disturbed the homeostasis of sodium. And now I need to do what?
Kick out the sodium.
I have to pump the sodium out, but only when I get 3 of them. 3 of
You
them.
only use one.
Yeah, and I use 1 ATP to get 3 of them out. Do you see that that's cheaper than pumping glucose in? Does that make sense to you guys? So this is called secondary active transport. So the first step, and I'm about to show you guys an animation of this one too. The first step was facilitated diffusion with a hitchhiker. Yes? What kind of protein does that first step require that moved sodium and glucose inside the cell? Carrier. Can't use a channel, right? For 2 reasons. First, glucose won't fit through a channel. And second reason is it's shape specific. I really only want glucose, right? That makes sense? So I need shape specific and I need something that will fit with glucose. Okay? So I'm moving glucose and sodium in. Okay? So that is facilitated diffusion with the hitchhiker. And then the second step has to fix the problem that you created by bringing in all that sodium. So the second step is active transport. That makes sense? So now, can you broaden your view just a second and see one reason why you spent all that time doing that? Right? Because you see that you're actually using this to your advantage, right? Now, anytime I want to get something in that I would generally have to pay for directly, I can use sodium to bring it in. And don't be at all surprised that you can use potassium to kick stuff out too, right? Because I've set up this concentration gradient. Okay, so let me show you an animation and I'll let you guys ask questions about that one too. By the way, these animations are on the links page of melanieb.com, so you can review these if you want to. Okay, so the only thing I don't like about this animation is that it doesn't show you something really important about this protein, and that this protein actually has a binding site for sodium and a binding site for glucose. And the protein really only changes conformation once both of them are bound, right? Even though you're using sodium's electrochemical gradient, it actually only changes conformation when you get both of them bound, okay? So what I'm going to have is the sodium and the sugar are going to be brought in multiple times. It doesn't just show it 3, but... And then what's going to happen is you've created a disturbance of homeostasis, which then you have to take care of with the sodium-potassium pump, right? Does that make sense? So this is like coupled transport. Is that okay? So this is secondary active transport. This is cheaper than doing primary active transport with glucose, right? Than just pumping glucose in, right? It's 2/3 cheaper. Does that make conceptual sense to you guys? Okay, so back to the notes for just a second. Okay, so with secondary active transport, this is one that's very commonly missed by students. So I want you to think about it and make sure that if you don't get it, you go back and review the video or the notes. It's a 2-step process and you need to understand what both of them are. The first step is facilitated diffusion through a carrier protein that has binding sites for sodium and potassium. I'm sorry, sodium and glucose. So this is a what protein?
Carrier.
And this is a what protein? Carrier, which is a pump, which is a carrier plus ATP. Okay, just make sure that I don't mind if you use the word pump, but always know that it is a carrier, right? That it's not a channel, right? So pump is not, pump is a carrier plus ATP. Go ahead.
So you were bringing sodium and glucose in. You bring 3 in, so you have to, on the other channel, you have to push out 3.
I mean, it's not directly, it's not like it knows when 3 come in, but it's disturbing the concentration gradient. So the sodium-potassium pump is going to try to fix it, right? It doesn't really know what this one's doing, but you are coupling those two, right? Because you disturb homeostasis while you're bringing in the pretty girl, right? And you're going to have to fix it. Like somebody's got to pay for her, right?
Okay, so that one over there.
This one?
No, the other one.
That's the sodium-potassium pump.
You push 3 out and then bring 2
Potassium's in.
potassium in.
It's the same pump you learned over there. It's the same pump. There is only one sodium-potassium pump.
Okay.
So, and that's how the glucose gets out too.
The glucose isn't getting out. The glucose is getting in.
It's just gonna stay in.
I'll talk about how it gets out later. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. It's a good question, though. Okay, so let's go back to your notes for a second. And, okay, so first step is facilitated diffusion with a hitchhiker through a carrier. And the second step is active transport with the sodium potassium pump, which is a carrier. Okay, so conceptually, you may or may not like this, but you can see that what you are doing here is, where is it? Oh, I lost. Is you can use, this is just a shorthand, this is that first step. You can use sodium to bring glucose in, right? This is, by the way, the same way that you bring amino acids in. This is the most common way, by the way, that you absorb glucose in your intestine and amino acids in your intestine. We'll talk about that at the end of class today. We'll actually put it into the human body. Note to self, though, there's no reason that you can't use sodium's electrochemical gradient more like a revolving door to pop something else out. Okay, so when you're moving in the same direction, it's called co-transport. When you're using it like a revolving door to pop something else out, it's called counter-transport. This happens at the intestines, this happens at the kidneys. It still doesn't require any ATP. It's just like sodium's pushing on the door, right? And you're pushing something else out at the same time. So that's called counter-transport, but we won't see that much until the end of the semester. Go ahead.
So when you're doing the glucose and the sodium through facilitated diffusion, it's still going down the concentration.
Yes.
And
No.
then- or
Sodium's going down the concentration. Glucose doesn't have to care about concentration.
It's just going with
Yes,
it. Okay.
right.
And then it uses the pump to go.
Yeah, yeah. You can move glucose regardless of concentration gradient with this one because you're using sodium's electrochemical gradient to make sure that you get it to move in, even if you already had a boatload of glucose.
So once you go down it, then you're going up it, out against it with the pump.
With the pump, yes.
Got it. Okay.
Are you good? Okay, so that's called secondary active transport. We will see specific examples of this at the end. We will use this to absorb the glucose from eating a Snickers bar from the lumen of my intestine all the way into my bloodstream. We will use this transport mechanism. Go ahead.
The secondary activation transport, is it only glucose or is it?
No, you can use it for amino acids too.
amino acids?
It's a different carrier protein, but you have a sodium glucose co-transport protein. You also have sodium amino acid co-transport proteins. Right? It's still shape-specific binding site, but it's a common mechanism of moving things inside the cell that you want, but you don't want to always pay for. Okay, so if any of you guys are table people, and generally nobody is but me, these tables right here, I love this one for two because what it does is it tells you which direction things move, whether they require energy, what the energy source is, whether it's passive or active, whether it's a channel or a carrier. So if you are a table person, that's a good place to sort of check and make sure you understand. If you're not, that's fine. Okay, so the last types of transport before we get into real body applications, you've already done before, so we'll go through quickly. So we just spent ATP for the first time with primary and secondary active transport, right? More expensive and slower than those two are these, which is what we call collectively vesicular transport, transporting things in vesicles. And individually, they're called endo and exocytosis. So there are three types of endocytosis and one type of exocytosis. So let's just go through them. You've seen them before. I want you to understand that these are super slow and very expensive, although, interestingly, they've never specifically figured out how ATP is used in endo and exocytosis. Like, they don't know the specific binding site. We do know that if you remove the ATP from the cell, it will cease to be able to do endo and exocytosis. So we know that they require it, but there's still some research to see it. Okay, so first one is phagocytosis, and phagocytosis is just a type of endocytosis where you're taking in whole big chunks of stuff. So like that example I gave you in which I'm a white blood cell, and this is a coccus bacterium. Fold around a solid chunk of something, form a vesicle, bring it in. That's phagocytosis. If it is a bad thing, then you fuse it with a lysosome and whoop up on it and all that. So that's phagocytosis. Energetically expensive, taking in solids. Next one is pinocytosis. Phago means to eat, pino means to drink. So if instead of taking in a solid, I fold it up around the extracellular fluid that has things dissolved in it, right? I'm taking in fluids. That's cell drinking. And I'll take in a vesicle full of ECF, which now I have inside the cell. And depending on whether it's something good or something bad, that's whatever the fate of it is, okay? And then the slowest, most expensive type is this. See if you guys can figure out why this one is slow. And that is receptor-mediated endocytosis. Here, what I want is something inside the cell that can't get through by any other mechanism, but it's something specific. Like I need it inside the cell. There's certain forms of cholesterol that need to move in. They're not soluble because of something about them. Certain forms of iron that need to move in by this way. It's really slow because what has to happen is it's receptor mediated. So you've got receptors on the cell surface. And what you're going to do is you're going to wait until those purple triangles bind, 1, 2, 3, and not until one of them binds because it's expensive, yes? Until multiple bind. And then that is the trigger for endocytosis. And then you take in a bubble that's filled with, among other things, the stuff that bound to the receptors, right? Receptor-mediated endocytosis. Do you see why this is going to be the pokiest of all the types of transports? To wait for everything to bind and not just one because it's really pricey, right? But all of them to bind before you do endocytosis. So this is basically when you can get it through by any other mechanism, but you need it inside the cell. And this is receptor-mediated endocytosis, okay? Certain forms of iron move by this mechanism. Okay. So, and then last but not least is just exocytosis. And we've already talked about it, but just to give you guys a visual for exocytosis.
Did you say exocytosis uses ATP?
Oh yeah, exocytosis is energetically expensive. So I just made a great big protein, and I really want to give it to you. They can't get it out. So what I do is bubble it up, usually at the Golgi apparatus, I bubble it up, okay? And then what I do is I take my little vesicle and I smash it up against the cell membrane. And as I smash it up against the cell membrane, the phospholipids join with the cell membrane. And notice that you dump the contents and you don't even lose any phospholipids, right? They just join with the cell membrane. And that is exocytosis. That is the mechanism by which cells get big, huge things out of the cell. Good? Okay, also slow, also energetically expensive. Okay, so before we start applying this to the human body, let's quiz ourselves. And I want you to raise your hand if you think you can get it. I promise I'll be nice and supportive. So in each of these situations, I want you to see if you can figure out how each of these substances would cross the cell membrane and why, right? So if you use an expensive mechanism, I'm going to ask you to tell me why you didn't use a cheaper one. Good? Okay. What type of transport protein? If there is a protein, you have to tell me whether it's a channel or a carrier. Okay. People all semester long, she told me last time, will use channel and carrier interchangeably, and you can't do that. They don't mean the same thing. So we're going to try to get that out of the way now. Okay, so first question is, how do you get oxygen to move down its concentration gradient? Simple diffusion, and tell me why. Why can you move, what? No charge, and what about its solubility? It's lipid soluble. Good. So oxygen doesn't have any transport problems, really. Unless you want to get it to move against its concentration gradient, then you're screwed because it won't. Potassium, moving down its concentration gradient. Raise your hand if you think you know. Go ahead. It is a channel. Why not straight through the cell membrane? Has charge. Exactly. Good. Needs a channel. It's still small enough that it can use a channel, right? But it's charged, so it can't diffuse straight through the cell membrane. You starting to get it? Next, an amino acid moving into a cell for protein synthesis. First time, I want you to move it down its concentration gradient. Amino acid down its concentration gradient into the cell for protein synthesis.
Carrier.
Carrier protein. Why?
Because it needs something to bind to.
Needs something to bind to, and what about it? It's big. It's too big for a channel, right? Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit to this question. I'm going to say amino acid moving into the cell for protein synthesis against its concentration gradient. Secondary active transport, yeah. That's the cheapest way you can get it in, right? Yeah?
Secondary active transport's always the cheapest way
It's cheapest.
to get glucose and amino acids.
Glucose and amino acids, yes.
Did you say for against?
Against its concentration gradient. Yeah, if it was with its concentration gradient, it could usually diffuse through its own carrier, right? Okay, next one. A large antibody protein secreted by a white blood cell. Exocytosis, why? Not any other mechanism? Too big, yeah? Too big? Makes sense. Okay. Don't answer this one. I love you, but let somebody else answer. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but just because some people won't think of the answer if somebody provides it. So water moving from a cell's ICF into a highly concentrated saline solution. You be quiet too, Brady. I appreciate the enthusiasm. I need to hear from this side of the room.
So it's moving from low to high, so then it would be.
Water is moving from a cell's ICF into, okay, who said osmosis? Osmosis? Osmosis, it is osmosis. And can anybody tell me what kind of solution that represents? Into a highly concentrated saline solution. Can you do it? Hypertonic. Yes, that's a hypertonic solution. And what water is doing is it's moving down water's concentration gradient, right? If it's a highly concentrated saline solution, then it's a lower concentration of water, right? Got it? Okay, last one. You're like, shut up, Melanie. This is enough. Okay, calcium being pumped into the calcium-rich extracellular fluid to allow for muscle relaxation. If I'm pumping it to, it is a carrier protein, but you need a little bit more. It's a what?
Is it pump?
It's a pump. It's a pump. I'm moving it against its concentration gradient, right? That's primary active transport, by the way. It's just moving something from its low concentration to its high concentration. That makes sense? Go ahead.
Can I ask, so on the water moving from the cell's ICF,
Mhm.
are we looking at solute concentration or water concentration?
Remember, you're always given solute concentration, but if you need I told you water's moving, right? Water is moving from a cell's ICF into a highly concentrated saline solution. So I told you water that was moving. So it's got to be osmosis, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and water's moving down water's concentration gradient. So you're almost never given the water concentration.
I had it down and now I'm just.
You'll get it. It just takes a little practice. And we're going to practice with it again in just a second here. Okay. So I know at least 2 people have this. I'm hoping there's a lot of quiet people who have it as well. I was never a class talker. I was always like the introvert who didn't talk. I know that's hard to believe, but I generally don't talk to people. Okay, so now we're going to put it in context. We are going to try to get stuff from your intestine into your bloodstream, right? Very important part of being a human. And we are going to do what's called epithelial transport, because we can probably agree that in order to get something from your intestine into your bloodstream, you need to cross an epithelial membrane, correct? Okay. Does anybody remember what kind of epithelium I am actually going to find lining the small intestine where you do most of your absorption? Anybody remember? You don't have to, I don't care. Nope. Yeah, it's columnar with microvilli. Yes, simple columnar with microvilli. Okay, so here's our objective. Eat something. It's in the lumen of your intestine. Get it across the apical surface. That's one transport, right? Then I have to get it across the basal surface. That's 2. Then it's in the interstitial fluid. Luckily, I don't have to worry about transporting it into the bloodstream because the capillaries there are mostly fenestrated. So it just like diffuses straight through the holes, right? Okay, so I'm going to set up 3 situations. So I'm going to move it lumen, apical surface, through the intracellular fluid, across the basal surface, into the interstitial fluid, and into the bloodstream. And the first thing that we're going to move 3 things. We are going to eat some Cheetos and absorb the sodium. Okay, we're going to eat a Snickers bar and absorb the glucose into our bloodstream. And then we're going to drink some water and get the water into our bloodstream, okay? And in each situation, we're going to try to figure out how we get it to move based on the principles that we've learned here, okay? So remember that your choices are going to be diffusion straight through the membrane if you can do it. Then what's the next? Channel, and then carrier, which would be facilitated diffusion, and then primary and secondary, which one's cheaper? Secondary is cheaper than primary. And I'll go ahead and tell you that none of these require endo and exocytosis, so you don't have to worry about those right now. Okay? All right, so we're going to do what we call transepithelial transport of sodium. It's moving, it just sounds complicated, but it really just means moving sodium across an epithelium. And so let's look at a figure. The figure initially looks kind of confusing, but it clarifies pretty quickly. All right, so Here's how we're going to get sodium in. I just ate Cheetos and the sodium is in the lumen of my intestine. First question is, how do I get it to move across the apical surface? Channel. I agree with you, but there is a reason that that will work, and that is because what do you know about the concentration of sodium in the intracellular fluid? It's less, right? I worked really hard to keep it low, right? If it was high here, I couldn't use a channel, correct? Okay, but it's low, so you can. Yes, that makes sense. So it's moving in via a channel. Everybody good with that? Okay, so now I need to get it across the basal surface. So now I need to get it from here to here. How do I move it across the basal surface and why? Pump. So I get pump, but can anybody tell me why you need a pump there? Yeah, it's going from low concentration to high concentration here, right? Because that's what we said about the relationship between sodium ICF to ECF, right? Low on the ICF, high on the ECF. And what do I use? I use it's a carrier protein. It's the sodium potassium pump, which is a carrier protein. And the sodium potassium pump will move sodium out and potassium in every time it moves, but it's okay because it'll just leak right back out through the leak channels, right? Okay, does that make sense? So how do you get it in the bloodstream? You don't have to worry about it because there's holes, right? It'll just diffuse straight into the bloodstream. Is that okay? Okay, so one more time. 2 questions about this one. What kind of protein is that? Channel. What kind of transport is this? Not facilitated. It's just diffusion or diffusion through a channel, but it's not facilitated. Okay, same question here. What kind of protein is this? Carrier. What kind of transport is this? Primary active transport. Primary active transport. Got it? Okay, go ahead.
So primary is just using the sodium and potassium.
It's just using a pump without anything else coupled to it.
Okay, secondary is using the
Secondary, you're like doing facilitated diffusion first and then using the pump.
Okay.
Okay? All right. So now I'm going to look at what it says in the notes. So the summary is basically that sodium comes into the epithelial cell by diffusion, leaves the epithelial cell by primary active transport, and then moves passively into the blood plasma. So I know it gets annoying, but being annoying is part of being a teacher. Can you understand that if you had a good knowledge, you would not have to memorize this? Can you see that? That if you really understand these concentration gradients and all of this stuff, this is not rote memorization. This is application of knowledge that you already have. That's what I'm going for you. Now, if you memorize it, that's totally fine. You can do that. It's just that it doesn't tend to stick for as long a period of time as you memorize. It doesn't stay with you for very long. Okay, so now let's try a different one. Now I'm going to eat a Snickers bar, and I'm going to try to absorb the glucose from the Snickers bar all the way into my bloodstream. You ready? Okay. So, luckily, almost anything sweet that you eat comes with some sodium, because have you ever made chocolate chip cookies and forgotten the salt? They suck. They're terrible. So, almost everything that you eat has sodium in it. So, we're going to use that to our advantage, because what I would like is I would like glucose in here, even if I already absorbed a boatload of glucose in there, because glucose is money, right? It's like the hottest of the molecules. You want all of it. Okay, so even if I already have a whole bunch of glucose in there, I want more glucose in there. So what's the mechanism that I am going to use to bring glucose across the cell membrane without paying for it directly? Secondary active transport. What kind of protein is this going to be? Carrier. It's going to have a binding site for sodium and a binding site for glucose, right? And it's going to move sodium and glucose in, right? And so this is really the first step of secondary active transport, which is really facilitated diffusion, right, with the hitchhiker. That makes sense? Okay, so now let's just follow glucose first, okay? So follow glucose. And this one you need to think about. Glucose is now inside the cell. I need it outside the cell. I have to tell you one thing just to see if to make it make sense. We never leave glucose hanging out here. We're always carrying it away. So keep that in mind. We're always carrying glucose away as soon as it gets into the extracellular fluid. So now, with that in mind, how am I going to get glucose to move from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid? Carrier. And what kind of transport is this going to be? Not secondary.
Primary.
Not primary. It's facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is moving something from high concentration to low concentration through a carrier. Yeah?
Because you're always getting rid of the
Because I'm always getting rid of the glucose. I had to tell you that part or else you wouldn't be able to know that, right? So you never leave glucose sitting around. It's because it's like there's piles of money. It's like got places it needs to go. So you don't like leave it sitting around there, right? So it's high in here and low in here, right?
So if it was the other way, low to high, would it be primary active then?
Then you'd have to transport it you'd have to use ATP in some way, shape, or form.
Okay.
Yeah, and this one wouldn't work because the concentration gradient won't work for that. So, so this is moving from high to low, and it does move through a carrier. I know you know, but I'm going to be annoying. Why does it need a carrier? Too big, yes. So I'm moving it across. And then once I get it out here, porous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries just gets carried away. Good? Okay, now I have to take care of the problem that I created after I move a few of them. And how do I take care of the fact that I'm accumulating too much sodium on the inside of the cell? Sodium potassium pump. Okay, so what kind of protein is that? Carrier. And collectively, these two are what kind of transport? These two are secondary active transport. Yes, when you couple the two of them together. Is that good? Okay. Go back and look briefly, and I want to tell you that these are actually color coded. The channels are always, are never coded purple. The carriers are purple. All the carriers are purple. And the channels are not purple, even though like kind of purple, that's actually like blue. Okay, so last thing, and we're done with the hard part. The last thing is to get water. So I'm going to drink some water now, and I want to get water all the way into the bloodstream. I hate these figures, but that's the only ones they provided. So now what I want you to understand is that by just eating Cheetos and taking in glucose, what I'm doing is moving massive amounts of solutes from the lumen, stick with me, to the ICF, to the interstitial fluid, to the blood plasma, correct? Massive amounts of solutes. So the direction of the solutes is moving here, 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 here. Now, as I'm moving massive amounts of solutes, what am I doing to the water concentration? So what I'm doing is if I move massive amounts of solutes, the water concentration is dropping right here. Then I move the solutes here and the water concentration drops here. Then I move the solutes here and the water concentration drops here. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a concentration gradient for water because I move so many solutes, right? And so the water moves in via what process? Osmosis. Doesn't it move in by osmosis? Because the solutes are creating a massive concentration gradient for water as you move the solutes. So my phys professor always said that solutes suck, right? And sodium sucks the most, right? So as you move solutes, water will move. Is that okay? Okay, so that's the transport mechanism for water. Good? Okay, so that's transepithelial transport of water. Okay, so last little tidbit is just to talk about filtration. And filtration is not covered in this chapter, but I think it's a logical place to cover it. Okay, so filtration is moving water and small solutes. It doesn't care about concentration gradients. It moves water and small solutes across a membrane from an area of high pressure to low pressure. It's pressure driven. Okay, so in the world, a classic example of filtration is coffee, making coffee, right? And this example worked a hell of a lot better in Texas than it does in Utah, but I know that you have seen it happen at some point. Okay, so you make coffee by making a filter, and the filter is porous, right? It has little holes in it. And if you pour water through it, then the pressure is actually going to pull water through the filter. And if coffee's in the filter, it's also going to pull anything small enough to fit through the holes, right? But it's not concentration driven, because even if there were grounds down there, it would still pull stuff through. And it's not at all selective, because if I put dirt in the filter, it would also pull the small particles of dirt or red Kool-Aid or whatever. So it's not at all selective except by size. And it doesn't require ATP at the site of transport. It just requires a pressure gradient. Does that make sense to you? Just a pressure gradient. So classic examples of where this occurs in the body is any place you have two fluids that have different pressures. So like here, here's the blood plasma. Here's the interstitial fluid, right? Which one of these two is higher pressure? Blood plasma, because there's a pump hooked up to it, right? And we know that at least some capillaries are porous, right? So water and small solutes like sodium and potassium and things like that will get pushed through. Does that make conceptual sense to you guys? That's actually where your interstitial fluid comes from, right? Okay, so water and small solutes. Now, should you be at normal pressures pushing whole blood cells through? No. But we know that you could get a bowling ball through a coffee filter if you hooked up a fire hose behind it once. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so the highest pressure capillaries in your body are at your kidneys. Your kidneys are really high pressure, really porous capillaries, and there's a whole bunch of surface area. There's 1 million nephrons per kidney. Your kidneys are doing massive amounts of filtration. As a matter of fact, the rest of the capillaries in your body combined, the rest of them, filter about 1 gallon of fluid per day, and your kidneys filter 47 gallons per day. Okay, now I want you to imagine what will happen at your kidneys if you are subjecting your kidneys to chronic hypertension, high blood pressure. Do you end up getting things in your urine that shouldn't be there? Like whole blood cells and large proteins, right? Chronic hypertension because you are hooking up a fire hose and you're getting bowling balls through. Are you doing kidney damage during that process?
Yes.
You are doing kidney damage during that process, absolutely. Okay, so that's the basis of filtration, which we'll talk about in the kidneys, but it happens at all of the places. I'm going to try to give you guys a quick and dirty about dialysis. Dialysis is what you do when your kidneys aren't working. This is a dialysis chamber. I'll pass it around for you. And the dialysis chamber, you can look inside. You can see how closely packed the dialysis tubing is. So let me explain to you how dialysis works. This is a type of dialysis called hemodialysis. And I'll show you on an image as well. Your brother is on dialysis? Okay. So with dialysis, generally what happens, and there's a bunch of reasons you could be on it, but generally it's because of some level of kidney failure. Okay? And when your kidneys are not functioning properly, they start losing functionality. Like for instance, they cleanse urea and uric acid and ammonia from your system. You guys with me? Which is part of what your kidneys do for you. So what I want you to imagine is you've got this dialysis chamber, and please note that it's got 4 hookups. In, out, in, out. Actually, I don't know which one's in and out. Just assume I'm right. In, out, and out. So blood goes in one side and back out the other side. And sometimes what's happening is they'll hook it, blood is coming out and then going back in, okay? And it's in a chamber, and then the chamber is in a dialysis machine that actually is generating the pressure so that you can send things through. Okay, so the blood's going to go in one side, and it's going to go back out, and then it's going to go back into your system. The other side is going to have a solution running through it, and you're going to do counter transport so that you get good exchange. What you're going to do is you're going to run clean dialysis solution in this side, and you're going to dump the dirty dialysis solution in the other side. Let's just stick to urea for a second. If my kidneys weren't functioning, I would be building up urea concentration, right? So what's going to happen is my blood is dirty and funky and has too much urea in it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the blood by one side of this membrane. And that membrane is all you're seeing in there. It's a highly folded membrane, so you have a whole bunch of surface area. And then I'm going to put the dialysis solution through the other side. And I have a high concentration of urea in my bloodstream. How much urea should I put in the dialysis solution? None. 0 urea. So what I'm going to do is I am going to run the dialysis solution the other way. And in order for this to work, I have to make this membrane permeable to urea. If I make the membrane permeable to urea, as my blood goes by, where's the urea going to travel? Into the dialysate. I don't circulate this. I dump it and put clean stuff in every time, right? And so every single time what's going to happen is I am pulling more urea out of the bloodstream into the dialysis solution, and I'm cleansing my blood. But one last question for you. Your kidneys work on filtration. What is this working on? What transport mechanism is it using? It's diffusion. It's just working on diffusion. And as a matter of fact, I just learned just recently, I don't know why this didn't occur to me, that based on what's going on with the person's body, you can make the membrane permeable to, for instance, not just urea and uric acid and ammonia. You can also make it permeable to glucose for a diabetic. So it's actually cleansing some of the glucose out of the system or permeable to other things. But one last question, and I'll let you guys go. You better make the two solutions wet tonic. Isotonic to one another. Otherwise, you're going to get crenation or you're going to get swelling and hemolysis. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so you will have a quiz next time, even if I have to come early to get the clicker beaten into submission. Yeah. No. You got calcium carbonate, just calcium.
Okay.
The only reason I teach this one is because you need it so much for the next 7 minutes. So that you can use it.
They just wouldn't have to go 3 hours.
Right, exactly. And actually don't need to
So the 1 ATP, the 5 ADP plus the.
Oh, this is 1 ATP dissociates to ADP plus an inorganic phosphate. It's just popping off.
So PI is possible.
Yeah, inorganic.
Secondaries and transport, like, yeah, with that, is it considered secondary?
Oh, sorry. God, tell me. Okay, I'll stop.
It's okay. I got it.
You stop that. That was my favorite part.
I'll stop it.
It's like before I ask questions.